Hello everyone! Dr. Jazzy Fresh has returned. It's been almost a year since I uploaded a video, and an even longer time since I focused on Final Fantasy. As Kingdom Hearts seems to be quiet for the moment, and Final Fantasy 16 will be released soon, I decided to return to my Final Fantasy Timeline Theory series. For those new to Final Fantasy, it's a franchise of standalone games creatively numbered by Roman numerals by when the game was released. So Final Fantasy 2 is not necessarily a sequel to Final Fantasy 1, as Final Fantasy 7 is not a prequel for Final Fantasy 8, and so on. The stories focus on the conflicts of light and darkness, fate and choice, and our perception of each. A while ago, the directors of the series confirmed the chronological order and connected two of the games. They said that Final Fantasy X is a prequel to Final Fantasy VII, but on a different planet or star, as they're more commonly referred to in the Final Fantasy universe. In the melee fighting game, Final Fantasy Dissidia, some of the main characters from each game are said to come from different dimensions. This can also be said as these characters came from different points and places in time. Keeping this in mind, I began a journey about 6 years ago in which I tried to place the main events for each Final Fantasy game in chronological order. At the time, Final Fantasy 14 was out, but I don't really play the online game, so I had limited information on the major events that occurred in this game. But of course, I come to find out that this game is the most important. Also during this time, Final Fantasy 15 was new and its backstory was not complete. Final Fantasy 16 and Stranger of Paradise related to Final Fantasy 1 were non-existent. Now with the clear backstory to Final Fantasy 15 and Final Fantasy 1 with the release of Stranger of Paradise, I began to look into the expansive story of Final Fantasy 14 and any little information that we have so far on Final Fantasy 16. I decided to rework the chronological order of events, and by rework, I mean completely rearrange the order, and I also added in Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. As you can see, this was my original order. I had Final Fantasy 6 for the Final Fantasy 1, then the Final Fantasy 5, and Final Fantasy 3. They were all on one planet but at different points in time. Final Fantasy 3 and Final Fantasy 2, in which Final Fantasy 2 was on its own planet, converged to give Final Fantasy 4 on a different planet, which flowed to Final Fantasy 9 and Final Fantasy 13. Separately, Final Fantasy X on its own planet flowed into Final Fantasy 7 on a different planet, and that eventually led to Final Fantasy 8. The start of the timeline was Final Fantasy 11, that flowed into Final Fantasy 14 and Final Fantasy 12. Final Fantasy 15 stood alone as a major convergence point. Furthermore, I had placed some games as their world was being in what's called the interdimensional rift, and this place is where time flows differently, and in this figure it's represented by these red circles. However, much of my understanding about the structure of the Final Fantasy universe has changed since Final Fantasy 14 is expanding our understanding of how the universe is structured. So with that said, I completely scrapped my order and restarted. Essentially, I literally had to flip the order of the games. Now we have my current order of events with the addition of Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles and Final Fantasy 16. I'm sure I might need to rework Final Fantasy 16 in this timeline as more background lore comes out with its release, so I will hold off on my other and more in-depth videos, but for now my timeline will start again with Final Fantasy 11 on its own planet. From Final Fantasy 11, we have Final Fantasy Type O on its own planet, then to Final Fantasy 5 on its own planet, Final Fantasy 13 on its own planet, and then to Final Fantasy 12 that also will occur on its own planet. And all these games are very pivotal in the setup to Final Fantasy 14 and developing its backstory, and then also just in general the setup to the Final Fantasy universe and the games I will call post Final Fantasy 14. And for those that know the major event that happened in Final Fantasy XIV, I'll kind of refer to the games that occurred before Final Fantasy XIV, pre-sundering era, and the games that occurred after Final Fantasy XIV, the post-sundering era. Now, within Final Fantasy's backstory, or I guess you could call it the earlier eras of the Final Fantasy XIV game, this is where I believe that maybe Final Fantasy XVI is happening. Some other planets come into play after Final Fantasy XIV, of course, with Final Fantasy III, 1, and 6 on the same planet at different times. Which again is pretty funny because originally I had Final Fantasy VI occurring before 1, and then 1 occurring before 3, so again I literally had to switch the order. Final Fantasy II remained on its own planet. Again, that one is always a little more trickier to place since there's not a lot of connections to Final Fantasy II and its story is pretty straightforward. Again, it was one of their earliest releases and they haven't really expanded the story much beyond the main game. There's no like spin-offs, or there may have been like a novel or something, but as far as I know, there wasn't any like spin-offs or movies or anything else expanding on Final Fantasy II. But anywho, moving on, we'll have Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles will merge with Final Fantasy IX, giving into that story of Terra Gaia merging that we know from Final Fantasy IX. Now, with Final Fantasy 15, I actually made a prequel to Final Fantasy 8. I did decide to put them on the same planet because originally I had Final Fantasy 8 and 7 on the same planet, but now I split them because I think the flow from 15 to 8 and then 4 to 7 makes a little bit more sense. So, of course, Final Fantasy 4 will be the prequel to Final Fantasy 7, with Final Fantasy 10 occurring in between Final Fantasy 4 and Final Fantasy 7. And yes, as you can see here, the placement of the game logos indicates the order or time that the main, as I again emphasize, the main events of the game, of these games occur. I believe this arrangement is pretty sound, and naturally I will explain why in this introductory video. And of course, there will be major spoilers for a lot of these games within this timeline theory series of videos. So, of course, got to put your spoiler alert out. So, they let you guys know if you're new to the Final Fantasy, some endings or beginning or backstories of the game may be ruined for you. But I'm hoping that even knowing certain events will occur in these games, it will pique your interest to play them yourselves and maybe even in this order. If you'd like to continue following this series on my Final Fantasy timeline theory, click that notification button and subscribe to my channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the proposed tale that is the Final Fantasy universe. In the beginning, there is a crystal world which resides at the center of the universe. A perfect balance of light and darkness, harmony and discord, one mother crystal of red and blue light. In the emptiness of space, the void, this became the source of chaos, disorder, and houses dark energy. The interdimensional rift is the source of time and holds the power of life in the form of aether. The crystal world became the source of the cosmos, order, and holds light energy. The mother crystal is in the heart and soul of every planet the void will birth. In empty universe, the mother crystal contemplates what life will look like and how the universe should be governed. Two wills are born from light and dark to become a goddess and god for worlds to come. 4 elemental crystals are born from the light: earth, wind, fire, and water spirits. The power crystalline dragon Shinryu manifested from the void with the power to return worlds to nothingness. The mother crystal summons Shinryu to the interdimensional rift, where he is given the task of harboring memories. He guards a powerful dark sword Ragnarok that can be used to reset the universe or bring about what's called the final days. Additionally, he can summon anyone from any point in time to and from the rift, a dimension between the void and the stars. The mother crystal creates a life cycle, the Big Bang. When a soul dies, it returns to the planet's mother crystal in the crystal realm of the planet. When the world dies, it is reborn from the memories held in the rift. Dark and light energies come together briefly to birth a new mother crystal from the crystal world, while a new planet is born from the void. Over time, knowledge and memories build up, and the humans advance to form their own complex societies. However, the Mother Crystal and its creations will be in the crosshairs of everlasting conflict between light and dark, man, machine, and magic. Final Fantasy XIV. The planet of Aetheres arose and prospered. The Convocation, 14 rulers, brought about new life forms by mastering the use of Aether while keeping law and order. One of the ancients, Hermes, created a being named Meteon to explore other planets, their life forms, and the meaning of life. She traveled to a variety of planets and moons in the Sea of Stars, the solar system. The first planet she visited was devoid of life. The next was covered in ice. The third was home to suicidal people who filled the heat death of the universe, while the 15th had a divine entity that turned on the people to then kill itself. The people of the 17th planet willingly ended their perfectly apathetic existence created by a god from the 4th planet. The 4th planet fell victim to a plague and environmental decay, the 6th also to a plague, the 8th to global war. The 7th planet she visited was populated by fiends with multiple limbs. They thought the more limbs that you had, the more intelligent you were believed to be. The 9th was a desert wasteland devoid of flora, but human-like bones were found there. Still venturing on, Meteon searched for life in a vast universe. She comes to the Alphatron planet, inhabited by a race of mechanical beings, the Omicron. They are devoted to military conquest, and created a strong weapon called Omega that wipes out their enemies, the dragons of Dragonstar. One got away, Megarsurum. However, Omega pursued it, and another strong dragon it will encounter, Shinryu. Frustrated by the meaningless lives they lived, Meteon destroyed what remained of both planets. Entering the farthest reaches of the universe, the Ultimatum, she encounters a new energy force, Dynasmus, energy of strong emotions. Her own overwhelming emotion of sadness starts to consume her. Meteon resolves to end life after concluding that life is nothing but suffering. Gathering the energy of despair, she creates the Song of Oblivion to stagnate the planet's aether and warp life's creations into horrible beasts called blasphemies. To prevent this, a great sacrifice, half of the population, was conducted, and Themis gave his body to create the primal Zodiarch to dispel this calamity called the Final Days. He created a barrier around the world to prevent the Oblivion Song from harming them. However, others did not find Zodiarch's actions to be a final solution, as his dark origin and his need for continued sacrifice to sustain him could not defeat Meteon's darkness. In time, one of the Convocation members, Venat, sacrifices herself to become the primal Hadelane as an alternative. She breaks Zodiarch apart and seals his main body on the true moon, which is converted into a spaceship to ferry people to another world so the Final Days fail to be averted. The Liparitz race was created to construct this spaceship. The conflict led to the division of the world into the Source World and 13 other dimensions. The Source World became known as Hadelane, and the people had no recollection of the Old World. However, some members of the Convocation survived the conflict. Traveling to the other 13 dimensions, also called reflections, they seek to restore Aetheris and Zodiarch. Though fragmented, Zodiarch is still able to halt the Final Days while Hadelane searches for a resolution. With that small introduction to Final Fantasy XIV, we have the setup for the games that fall in the so-called Pre-sundering era. These are the planets that Meteon visited, and some were already in their dead state. Others, like Spira Final Fantasy X, which started on the world containing the fiends with the multiple limbs, and Eos of Final Fantasy XV, which was the planet that started off in a frozen state. their stories will continue post-sundering. Now, I won't go into too much detail of each game and their events in this video, so at this time, the bullet points here may or may not make sense to a newcomer, but I hope it will pique your interest nonetheless. For veterans, I will highlight the major connection points to reason my order of these pre-sundering era games. Final Fantasy XI and its world of Vana'diel remains the first game, as I believe it's a great introduction to the first deities, a dawn goddess and a twilight god, who also mention the existence of Shinryu as a bringer of Ragnarok. This game I also feel is a good introduction to the summons. In this game they're called Celestials, but they're creatures that we've come to know and love, such as Ifrit and Shiva, Ramu and Titan and Bahamut. But in the end, the planet probably naturally died out. Final Fantasy Type 0 and its world of Orients I put after Final Fantasy XI, as we are introduced to a new set of deities such as Etra of Death, Lindsay, which is a maker of the lower deities or summons in this game, which are called Fal'Cie, and Pulse, who is a cultivator of the land. I believe these three are the symbols of the warring triad deities, the goddess, the demon, the human, that will be recreated in Final Fantasy XIV and mentioned in other Final Fantasy titles as well. Pandemonium is also a major plot point in this game, and it's a good starting point for its future appearances. And yes, spoiler alert, Marshal Cid is a divine deity in this world who would kill everyone in Orience and then himself while creating an annoying time loop. Lastly, both Final Fantasy Type 0 and Final Fantasy XI have Gilgamesh, an interdimensional rift traveler, and either a companion in Lion or Enkidu, but they are not in the form that we've come to know and love. But fear not, I placed Final Fantasy V directly after Final Fantasy Type O, and Final Fantasy V is a game that gives us the origin story to the warrior Gilgamesh and his demonic companion Enkidu. This game also has the first appearance of Omega, a weapon that pursues strong opponents such as Shinryu and other great dragons. So naturally, the later stage of Planet R was referred to as Alphatron by Medion. Next we have Final Fantasy XIII, which is a sequel to Final Fantasy Type O, but since Gilgamesh makes an appearance, the normal, common form of Gilgamesh that we're used to seeing makes an appearance in this game, I placed it after Final Fantasy V. The chaotic events of Final Fantasy XIII, with the world of Pulse and Cocoon merging with the unseen world of death, fits with the planet being a victim of environmental decay. Honestly, Final Fantasy XIII could also fit the devoid of life planet based on its ending too. Lastly and interestingly, the descriptions of the beings of the apathetic planet is the ideal world deity Bonavezal wanted in Final Fantasy XIII, so maybe he achieved his goal elsewhere. Due to the descriptions of the planet that Medion visited, I was able to order those games from Final Fantasy XI going to Type O to Final Fantasy V and then to Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XII I placed directly before Final Fantasy XIV, as they are very closely related and overlap in some characters that they share. Yes, Final Fantasy XII also has the appearance of Gilgamesh and Enkidu. However, why Enkidu was in a form of a sword in Final Fantasy XIII, and then even in Final Fantasy XII now he's in a different form as a dog. Enkidu again is a little up in the air in terms of what's going on there. Gilgamesh looks the same, but Enkidu keeps being a master shapeshifter for all we know. Anyways, as we also have a new setup of deities, the Akuria, they created these dark and light Shions, but they're also referred to as Espers in this world. Now, the dark Espers are summons in the game, while their light counterparts are mentioned but never showed. But we are introduced to them in Final Fantasy XIV, who are the main rulers of the world of Ithris in the form of the Convocation members. We find that the origin of the light goddess Hadeline is the Akuria Venat. Zodiac remains the god of darkness, and I guess seems to be summoned to the planet by the people, and his vessel becomes Themis, or Elidibus is another name for him. Final Fantasy XIV in general has a plethora of lore for the Final Fantasy universe. The convocation members even foreshadow some important characters to come, while one even looks like a mix between Lightning and Yule of Final Fantasy XIII. Here you can see that I have some guesses for how some of these convocation members are reborn into later worlds, such as for Logreath and Michan, who are said to have remained, or they said that they will return to this first world that was created, which will probably be the planet that Final Fantasy I will occur on, while others like Elidibus or Themis, whatever you want to call him, is shown to disguise himself as a warrior of light in Final Fantasy I, but as we know, this warrior of light from Final Fantasy I is also supposed to look like Cid of Lufane, which is an ancient in that game. But even though he's calling himself a warrior of light, we know that Elidibus is the host to Zodiac, who is the embodiment of darkness. So that complicates things a little bit. And I think that's an interesting point that Final Fantasy likes to highlight in their, just kind of in their thinking and their philosophy, is that you might have a darkness parading as a light, or a light can easily become a darkness, or sometimes a person that thinks they're on the light side has to go to the dark side to force the light side to come through. It's a whole thing, again, you'll see in Kingdom Hearts as well. And it's a lot, and I've again talked about this a lot with my Kingdom Hearts theory videos, so it's the same type of idea in the Final Fantasy universe as well. Anywho, if you have any ideas of who these members with question marks next to them could be, hit me up in the comments section. Maybe I missed something, but in terms of some of the members, I didn't find much information on their role or who they possibly could be in other Final Fantasy games. Lastly, I believe Final Fantasy XVI is occurring on the Source Planet during its 4th Astral Era and leading into the 5th Umbral Era. In Final Fantasy XVI, the main characters are Dominants who host icons, aka summons like Ifrit and Shiva. Now in Final Fantasy XIV, these icons are called primals, or eidolons, or I think even icons as well. And also Final Fantasy XVI has a more ancient medieval dark feel to it, so maybe again it's set before the main events of Final Fantasy XIV, which primarily occur after the 6th Astral Era. Currently, the Final Fantasy XVI backstory is told as a technology-advanced sky-based civilization once dominated the world 15,000 years ago before a great war caused the sky civilization to collapse, with remnants of it scattering across Valisthea. In the present, the sky civilization is treated as a legend. The legend I think they are referring to is Zane and the Allegan Empire with its floating continent. The floating continent holding Elysia with all its advanced technologies collapsed at the end of the 4th Umbral Era. The crystallized Psychus Tower sunk into the ground as pieces of it scattered throughout the world. Remnants of the Allegan civilization became also scattered across the world. And apparently 15,000 years later, the planet is now called Valisthea as the people rebuild. Knowing other games with floating continents like Final Fantasy III and Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy XVI can also be moved to a later point. However, these games do not highlight the Mother Crystal as much as Final Fantasy XIV does. Also, if Final Fantasy XVI ends in an ice age caused by Shiva, I will literally scream, because the 5th Umbral Era is the age of the endless frost. I mean, someone needs to cool down this conflict brewing between Ifrit and everybody else. If Phoenix throwing in there too, you fire. But it would be nice, but it would be a nice reversal to the backstory of Final Fantasy 15, which started off with Shiva freezing everybody and then Ifrit coming in and heating things up. But we'll see how Final Fantasy 16 will end. Hopefully it's just a one-shot game and they don't do other spin-offs and episodes and downloadable content, but Square Enix will be Square Enix. They'll do what they want to do. But anyway, to finish up this video, not to make it too long, I will flash a series of slides you can read at your own pace. In the coming series of videos, I will continue my timeline theory as we dive into the rest of the Final Fantasy main title games. Amazingly, I was able to neatly place all the planets or stars in the Final Fantasy universe to reflect our universe. Essentially, the first dimension of the Sundering will become World A, or better known as Mercury. Eos, in which Final Fantasy 15 and 8 occur, will become Venus. The blue planet, in which Final Fantasy 4 and 7 will occur, will become Earth. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles will be Terra, while Final Fantasy 9 will be Gaia, and those will merge to become Mars. Final Fantasy 2's world, which I call Pandemonium, will become the giant behemoth, aka Jupiter. Final Fantasy 11 occurred on Saturn, Final Fantasy 13 on Uranus, Final Fantasy 12 on Neptune. Our solar system's dwarf planets include Final Fantasy Type O on Sedna, Final Fantasy 10 on Pluto, Final Fantasy 14 and 16 on Haumea, and the 13th dimension, aka the Void, on Eris. Last but not least, Final Fantasy 5 occurred on Makemake, and the Lunarians from Final Fantasy 4 will make a new home on Ceres. I believe the Astral Belt will play a major role in meteors being sent to other planets, including Final Fantasy 15's Eos, Final Fantasy 7's Gaia, and Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles planet, which I believe to be Terra from Final Fantasy 9. I propose the Emperor from Final Fantasy 2 may have something to do with it. He loves to use the Starfall attack against enemies, and seeks to conquer the universe. So for now, I will leave you with that thought, and that's all I have to say about that. Thank you for watching. Please leave a comment below. Please share my video with all your Final Fantasy Fantic friends. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. Subscribe and hit the notification button so you'll know when the next part drops. Until next time, take care.